this presentation is going to look at Shrii Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar's ideal form of government. And as Chandra mentioned, it's divided into two parts. So as most of you will be aware, Shrii Sarkar discussed several forms of government, and his ideal form is discussed in this presentation. Section 1 provides some historical and ideological context, does this by discussing the social cycle, which is a cyclic theory of history, but focuses on the concepts of transitional periods and the nucleus of the social cycle. It also outlines the nature of spirituality. So this section provides some conceptual framework. Section 2 discusses Shrii Sarkar's ideal leader and his proposals for how they can best govern society. This is the applied side. So many of you will be aware of Shrii Sarkar and the work that he's done. There's a brief introduction there to his contribution. You're also aware of Prout, that his socioeconomic theory he propounded, and his discourses were collected together into one series that he called Prout in a Nutshell. And I'll be referring to that series throughout this presentation, and some references are there. If you would like to follow up on them, I'll give a copy to Dada at the end of the presentation, and you can collect a copy from him. So section 1, let's begin. To properly understand the author's ideal form of government, several different concepts need to be understood. These concepts include transitional periods and the nucleus in the social cycle, and also the nature of spirituality. These concepts are outlined below. The social cycle describes the cyclic movement of society through different eras, each dominated by a different social class. The cycle repeats itself, but the form of subsequent class-based eras also varies from previous eras. The cycle describes the broad sweep of social movement dominated by successive social classes and can be described, characterized as a theory of macro history. Leaders in each era of the social cycle develop systems of government that best suit their needs, and some features of systems developed in one era may be retained in a subsequent era. The various forms of government discussed by the author, except his ideal system, have their roots in the different eras of the social cycle. The concept of transitional periods can be understood in two ways, and both are important. First, a transitional period is the period of transition from one age to the next in the social cycle. One age in the social cycle does not transform into the next overnight. Decades or even centuries may pass before the subsequent age fully replaces the former age. Indian history perhaps provides the clearest examples of the movement of the social cycle and periods of transition. The Mahabharata War, which took place about 3,500 years ago near where Delhi is located today, marked the formal end of the martial era in Indian history and the beginning of the next age, the age of intellectuals, ministers, and priests. The author mentioned that Shri Krishna once said to the Pandavas in the Mahabharata, once a promise is made, it must be kept, for that is Dharma. But if to keep that promise you will cause harm to society, then to break the promise will be Dharma, and points out that this is a maximum of the intellectual era, not the martial era. So we may conclude that Shri Krishna, by bringing about the Mahabharata war and teaching Bhagavad Dharma in the Bhagavad Gita, ended the martial era in Indian history and began the intellectual era. However, it took another 1,000 years before several great personalities such as Buddha, Mahavir Jain, and Patanjali emerged to consolidate the intellectual era. Their ideas became influential in the post-Vedic age. This 1,000-year period between the formal end of the martial era and the consolidation of the subsequent intellectual era is the transitional period. So the martial era in Indian history ended with the Mahabharata War. The capitalist era started with the British. The British arrived in India in Surat in 1608, and after their victory in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, began their rule in Bengal. So we see the intellectual era in India lasted over 3,000 years. India achieved independence from the British in 1947, and today the capitalist era is still continuing. From the viewpoint of the social cycle, British rule represented a period of transition to an independent capitalist era in India. These days, the social cycle is moving faster than it did in the past, but still an age in the social cycle does not last a few decades or a century. It lasts many centuries. So we would expect a period of transition from one era to the next in the social cycle to last a century or more. Secondly, this is the second type of transitional period. Secondly, a transitional period also refers to the transition from one level of collective consciousness in human society to a higher level, say from a materialistic awareness to a more spiritual awareness. This type of transition is not the same as the transition from one class to another in the social cycle, and only happens every few thousand years or so, although there may be some overlap between those two types of transition. Humanity now is living through both types of transition. We may say that the second type of transitional period on the planet started last century, shortly after World War I, and first became noticeable soon after World War II. At that time, a number of people began to realize that they were living in a transitional period of the second type. Depending upon the frame of reference we use to analyze this second type of transitional period, it can last several centuries. This type of transition can also involve several phases. For example, last century saw an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. Communism collapsed in the late 1980s and early 1990s and has now vanished from nearly all the countries in the world, except perhaps China. As a consequence, humanity took a step forward on the path of human progress. So in this instance, the transition from the materialistic, atheistic ideology of communism to the self-centered ideology of global capitalism represents one phase in the transitional period. Further phases of this type in the transitional period may occur in the not too distant future. In other words, the transitional period of the second type maybe has some more phases to go. The nucleus of the social cycle. Another important concept to grasp with respect to the social cycle is the notion of the nucleus. Just as a wheel has a circumference and a hub, the social cycle has a periphery and a nucleus. As the social cycle rotates, the social classes at the periphery move around the nucleus, but one class is always dominant. Assuming the social cycle continues to progress, the cycle gradually develops higher forms. In this respect is like a spiral, and also gradually tends towards the nucleus. At the center of the social cycle are leaders whom the author describes as Sadviparas. The notion of Sadviparas is discussed below in section 2. The one who creates Sadviparas is known as a Mahasadvipara, which is a philosophical term for Taraka Brahma. Taraka Brahma should be understood in the personal sense as the personal embodiment of infinite consciousness. Sadashiva, Shri Krishna, and Shrii Sarkar, also known as Shri Anandamurti, are historical examples of Taraka Brahma. About 7,000 years ago, Sadashiva systematized the various expressions of human life: dance, music, medicine, civilization, spirituality, etc. In so doing, he laid down a firm foundation for society and provided humanity with the impetus to progress in various ways. This foundation also enabled the existing martial era to develop more systematically with greater speed. Some 3,500 years later, Sri Krishna also created a great change in human society and infused a tremendous wave of progress. By instigating the Mahabharata War, he ended the martial era and ushered in the intellectual era in the social cycle. The author also points out, however, that Sadashiva had to spend a lot of time to build a strong foundation for spirituality in society, and Sri Krishna lost a lot of time to the Mahabharata, so neither could build a strong social order. More recently, Shrii Sarkar continued the work of Sadashiva and Sri Krishna and built up the nucleus of the social cycle by propagating various spiritual practices and a comprehensive ideology suitable for the current age, and brought together a group of dedicated people and taught them to work in an organized way, and thereby created conditions necessary for Sadvipras to emerge in human society. Sadvipras must be great spiritualists, so to understand the concept of Sadvipras and the type of administration the author envisages that they will create, we also need to understand something about spirituality. What is spirituality? Another way of framing this question is to ask, what is the meaning of life? To answer these questions, first we need to understand that spirituality consists of two aspects, the impersonal and the personal. Both are essential. Together they provide a complete understanding. The impersonal is philosophical, epistemological. The personal is experiential, phenomenological. The personal enables us to engage in a discussion about spirituality and gives rise to spiritual philosophy. The personal has little to do with philosophy. Rather, it enables us to experience spiritual bliss and merge into infinite consciousness. Each has three core aspects. We may expand this list, but if we try to shorten it, we will take away an essential feature of spirituality. The impersonal is monotheistic, non-dualistic, and universal and rational. The personal is practical, a lifestyle choice, and devotional. It is also important to note that spirituality is fundamentally different from religion. They're completely different paradigms. So we'll quickly go through the core concepts in each. The impersonal, monotheism. Monotheism means one God, not many gods. From the viewpoint of spiritual philosophy, God means infinite consciousness, supreme consciousness, cosmic consciousness. From the spiritual point of view, God is non-attributional, but can be discussed and explained in philosophical terms. In contrast, some religions are monotheistic and some are not. The so-called Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are monotheistic religions, but several other religions are not. While all the Semitic religions accept the existence of God, they ascribe various attributes to God, and these attributes take on a life of their own and may even contradict each other. This creates confusion. Spirituality rejects this approach. While it is monotheistic and says God is supreme consciousness, it discusses the concept of God in philosophical language and does not ascribe attributes to God. Non-dualism. Non-dualism means interconnectedness or oneness. There are not two separate entities, such as our physical or material existence and our spiritual existence. From the spiritual perspective, everything is part of one interconnected whole. Actually, in spiritual philosophy, non-dualism is more comprehensive than this basic notion of non-dualism, but for our purposes, this basic notion is sufficient. In contrast, all the Semitic religions are dualistic. They teach that if we live a good life, after we die we go to heaven and live beside God for the rest of eternity. This, of course, is a simplification, but the essential idea is that we forever remain separate from God. There is God and there is us, and there is always a gap in between. This is classic dualism. Spirituality rejects this religious belief. Universal and rational. If spirituality is monotheistic and non-dualistic, it must be universal. Everything is included within it, so there cannot be any discrimination. All narrow ideas, dogmas, and superstitions are rejected. And it also must be rational in the deepest sense of the term. That is, we use our rational faculty to discriminate between good and bad, the proper and the improper, and in choosing the good, we make progress in life. But in choosing the good, we choose to follow cardinal human values, that is, Dhamma and Niyama, which provide us with the momentum to progress towards spirituality. And the momentum itself ultimately is derived from infinite consciousness. This is the deep meaning of rationality. Now, all this means that the impersonal aspect of spirituality rejects all forms of dogma and superstition and the narrow ideas that lead to various types of discrimination. It also means that spirituality is strongly pro-science and rejects pseudoscience, the personal. The first one is spiritual practice. Spirituality is practical in that spiritual progress is achieved by performing spiritual practices, spiritual meditation. There are various types of meditation. Some are spiritual and some are not. In spiritual meditation, there are both non-dualistic and dualistic meditation, sometimes called tantric and Vedic meditation practices. Genuine spiritual meditation is always non-dualistic, which means the goal of meditation is to merge into infinite consciousness. There are several ways to tell whether or not a particular system of meditation is a genuine system of spiritual meditation, but two are especially helpful. The first is that all the practices are designed to help the meditator merge into infinite consciousness. The second is that the practices are free. They do not cost any money. Now, this is a quick and easy way to tell if someone is teaching today genuine spiritual meditation. There are many people today selling spiritual practices. In contrast, prayer is a religious practice. It is fundamentally dualistic. A lifestyle choice. Spirituality is a lifestyle choice. We choose to live a spiritual lifestyle. The essence of a spiritual lifestyle is sometimes described as subjective approach and objective adjustment. This is generally understood to mean that internally we move towards infinite consciousness and externally we adjust with the world around us. But objective adjustment also should be understood to mean that we endeavor to help all creation move towards infinite consciousness. In other words, we make an effort to adjust the environment around us so that all can progress towards spirituality. Another way of describing such a lifestyle is pragmatic idealism. The ideal is infinite consciousness, and as we move towards the ideal, we make pragmatic adjustments with the world around us, but we also pragmatically adjust the world around us in order to help all move towards infinite consciousness. This approach is in stark contrast to naive idealism, which, because it lacks both a clear ideal and proper objective adjustment, is prone to all kinds of dogmas, superstition, devotion. The most important aspect of spirituality is devotion. Devotion means love for infinite consciousness, but in a personal sense. In biopsychological language, love is a propensity in human beings which is located in the midpoint of the chest. When this love is properly developed, internalized, and focused at a mental point associated with the pineal gland, a meditator can merge into infinite consciousness. This is the inner secret. The author describes devotional sentiment as the highest and most valuable treasure of humanity. He considered devotional sentiment so important that he developed a whole new branch of philosophy centered around it, which he called neo-humanism. So from the impersonal viewpoint, spirituality is that which concerns infinite consciousness. From the personal viewpoint, spirituality is the endeavor to merge our mind into infinite consciousness through spiritual meditation by developing devotion. So the purpose of human life is to become one with infinite consciousness, to merge our mind into our soul and our soul into infinite consciousness. This is the true meaning of yoga and is the meaning of life. The meaning of life for human beings will never change. 10,000 years ago, this was the meaning of life. Today it is unchanged, and 10,000 years from now, it will still be the same. This is the essence of spirituality. The important point to take away from all of this is that these types of ideas on spirituality need to be widely accepted and understood in society before spiritual leaders can emerge in great numbers and form governments. That's the key takeaway from the previous section. So let's have a break here. If anyone has any questions, we can discuss them. And if not, we can continue with section 2.
Thank you, Jayanta. That was a very good sociological, philosophical context, if you like, to Proutist philosophy. Thank you very much for that. So I invite people to put their questions into the chat box if they could. I've got one question already here. Is it possible to see a Varna, Jayanta, evolving into the next Varna of the social cycle, perhaps in terms of values, that we see a shift in values? Are we seeing this at the moment at the end of this capitalist Varna as we evolve into the next Varna? What are your thoughts?
It's an interesting question. There's a few ways to answer it. From the viewpoint of the transitional age, there's a movement from one class to the next. Most countries in a capitalist era, they'll move into a post-capitalist era in due course. From the viewpoint of the transitional age that moves from a lower level to a higher level of human consciousness, absolutely, there'll be higher values, a more universal outlook. We would expect humanity to become closer together, to be somewhat more ethical, and these things will have a profound effect on humanity as a whole. Would expect humanity to become closer together in a global sense. By that, I don't mean in a capitalist global sense, but in a one human family sense. So all of these things may well be foundational values for the next phase of the human cycle, depending upon how it all plays out.
Great. Thank you, Jayanta. Does anyone else have any questions at this stage? Okay, so here's another question here. How much does the Varna age represent the leaders being of a particular class versus society at large transitioning to a more predominant of that Varna? So how much does the Varna age represent the leaders being of that particular class? Yeah, are they representative of that particular Varna?
Generally, yes. Generally, most of the leaders we find in society in any given period represent to a very large extent the psychology of that Varna or class as a whole. In the capitalist era, the interesting thing is, for the most part, we see the leaders emerging who are not actually capitalists as such. The capitalists tend to say a little bit in the background. They are what the author describes as pseudo-capitalists. In other words, they are intellectuals who identify strongly with the capitalists and who are prepared to do the bidding of the capitalists, use their intellect to further the capitalist age and to sell their soul to the capitalists, if you like, and they are the ones who come forward. Now, if you look over recent presidents in the United States, probably the exception is Donald Trump. He had a capitalist psychology. That is relatively unusual. Most of the other recent presidents we could describe as pseudo-capitalists. People like Obama, people like Bush, people like Clinton, and so on. These people essentially were lawyers, they're trained intellectuals, but they strongly identified with capitalism, with American dominant values, and put all their energy into furthering the agenda of the ruling class in America. So this gives you some idea of the psychology of the leaders with respect to the psychology of the dominant class.
Right, and I just noticed the second part of that question, versus society at large, perhaps other leaders that are coming up within society who may be more representative of the next Varna. Is that possible also?
Yes, the other interesting thing we're seeing now is polarization. The author talked about this in a number of places, and essentially from the viewpoint of moving society forward from one Varna to the next, polarization is a good thing, and actually it should be supported and accelerated. In other words, you have the old and you have the new, and the values that you're talking about, the so-called progressive values, will be found amongst those who are moving towards the new, what is coming in the future. And the values of the old age will be those who are clinging on to the old, the current status quo.
Very good. Thank you, Jayanta. Another question. Are theocratic governments necessarily spiritual? Can a non-theocratic government be spiritual? It's an interesting question.
Bureaucratic governments.
Theocratic. So
theocratic.
Yes.
Okay. A first point to notice is that Prout doesn't support theocratic governments. Theocratic government is defined in a general sense as a government of a particular religion. Examples are theocratic governments in East Asia, the Middle East, and in other countries. I don't need to mention them all. You understand what I'm talking about.
Sure.
In all of those countries, you will find people who have a strong religious bent of mind in positions of leadership. Generally, theocratic governments do not have progressive values, or how shall we say this politely, are not spiritual. They are religious. So clearly, Prout doesn't support this. If you check the author's writings, you'll find in a couple of places he was clearly against theocratic governments. But on the other hand, he was strongly supporting leaders having spiritual values, ethical values, and universal humanistic values. So there is a big difference between theocratic/religious leaders and spiritual/ethical universal leaders. The two are really mutually exclusive.
Thank you, Jayanta. And here's another very interesting question. Is the technocratic movement in society at present, information age revolution, that wants to install artificial intelligence into the human body, is that spiritual? Is that progressive?
Look, the simplest way to think about it, I think, is to understand that we as human beings have three aspects to our nature. We have the physical, and that enables us to interact with the material world around us. We have the mental and emotional, the psychic, and then we have the spiritual, physical, mental, spiritual, matter, mind, consciousness. That's the basic paradigm, and we can expand that in all sorts of ways. Technocratic data, materialistic type things are important, but essentially they deal with things largely on the materialistic level. Of course, information is not totally materialistic. It has a mental or psychic component to it, but it's not always, to some extent it's value free, but it's not always value free. What Prout tries to do, and what an ethical and spiritual perspective tries to do, is to infuse progressive, humanistic, universal values into any kind of materialistic paradigm, so that we move from matter to mind and mind to consciousness. That's the basic framework. That's the basic path of human progress. And the more that those humanistic, universal, spiritual values, in other words, the path of what we call human dharma, the path of human progress, are infused into the different things that human does, the more progress there is. That's the essential principle.
Thank you, Jayanta. And just two more questions here. Are there sub-waves of the main Varna, subtypes perhaps? How to distinguish the sub-waves from the main Varna? So within that Varna, are there different dynamics going on?
That's a really interesting question, and it's a very good question, and it's difficult to answer quickly. It requires a fair bit of research and study, and you'll see from, particularly in the author's book, Shrii Sarkar's book, Human Society, he gives lots of examples. And even in the intellectual era in Indian history, from around 3,500 years ago to around about the period of, say, 1600, he gives examples of kings who were very progressive and beneficial, but he also gives many examples of intellectuals, ministers who were the power behind the throne and who also had an impact on the kings. So some people say, well, the kings were in power, it must have been a martial era. And others say, well, no, the priests were in power, and the intellectuals and the ministers, and they were shaping how the king behaved. So there's an overlap. Even though the author considers that long period of 3,000 years as an intellectual age, there was still a system of monarchy that existed into the intellectual age. And even today in the capitalist era, we can see that the system of monarchy still exists. So when we look at different periods of history from the point of view of social classes, we have to look at the big picture, the broad trend, and then try and work back and see what the different flows are. But it's not always an easy task.
Excellent, Jayanta. Very good. Just running out of time for this question period, but there's another question here. Was there a martial control in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, or was the communist rule actually a Viprin society, a Prati Viplava from the capitalist age back to the intellectual age? That happened in Iran. So basically, if the communist leaders were Vipras, how could they establish a warrior martial era? That's essentially the question.
Look, it's a good question. The strongest clue that we have from this is a particular quote that the author gives in Human Society Part 2, where he, in a simple paragraph, he gives a summation of where human society was in 1963 when he dictated Human Society Part 2. And in that quote, he says that a couple of countries have moved into the post-capitalist martial era. And from what the author said privately and what people understand that to mean is that the countries he's talking about were essentially China and Russia, and maybe one or two others. Now, both of those countries had what could be described as proletariat revolutions. Certainly there was such a revolution in Russia, and in China there was also a civil war going on. So if we accept that analysis, the key point is the psychology that was in play at the time. And the psychology in both cases was predominantly a martial psychology. In other words, there were revolutions going on in the society. One in Russia to overthrow the feudal system, and in the case of China, it was a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. But essentially, there was a martial dynamic going on that brought in a new psychology.
Thank you, Jayanta. Again, the bigger picture, isn't it, what's going on? And just one last quick question. What is your opinion about the World Economic Forum? Just a quick answer there, really.
Look, to be honest, I don't really have an opinion about it. You know, there are lots of things going on in the world. As I see our role is, as Shrii Sarkar said, is to unite progressive people, unite ethical people, and move ahead in a systematic way. You know, there are lots of ways we can do this, and people really need to do what inspires them, and, you know, work in a positive way, and the outcomes will be good.
Great. Thank you, Jayanta. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with section 2. This is a bit more practical, but it draws on the concepts we've outlined in the previous section. In this section, we discuss the author's ideal leader and his proposals for how they can best govern society. In particular, we look at the notion of sadviparas, the selecto-electional system, and government by boards and subboards, and finally we summarize the main points of the Sadvipra board system. Sadviparas and the social cycle. As we saw in section 1, a Mahasadvipra creates Sadviparas, which is done by creating conditions necessary in the nucleus of the social cycle for Sadviparas to emerge in society. The first point to note is that the author clearly states that only psychic and spiritual education can create Sadviparas. He is referring in particular to moral and spiritual education. So those wanting to become Sadviparas would need to get the right kind of education and to properly develop themselves mentally to elevate themselves spiritually. And after getting the right kind of education, we would expect them to have achieved a high level of attainment, if not the highest level. In addition, not only does the author state that Sadviparas are located in the nucleus of the social cycle, he also says they control the social cycle. But what does control the social cycle mean? Sadviparas control the social cycle in two main ways. First, they fight against the exploitation of the social classes that dominate at the periphery of the social cycle. For example, he says that in the martial era, if the martial class exploits others, the Sadviparas may have to resort to physical force. In the intellectual era, if the intellectual class exploits others, the Sadviparas will have to bring about an intellectual a revolution in the intellectual field. And in the capitalist era, the Sadviparas will have to contest and win elections. Regarding contesting elections, in 1968, the author established the Proutist Bloc of India, PBI, to contest elections in India. Subsequently, in 1977, he established Proutist Universal. And by the end of 1978, he had established 44 socioeconomic movements for India. He also encouraged similar movements to be established throughout the world. In 1977, PBI was merged into PU, and elections were no longer contested from the platform of PBI. After 1977, elections in India were contested only from platforms of various socioeconomic movements that had been established in 1978. Now, this history is interesting because what this means is that there is little point at this time in contesting elections from a general platform, such as PBI, as was done in the past. That phase is past. Rather, elections nowadays should be contested from the platforms of the various socioeconomic movements that have been established around the world. Further, the author also strongly recommended that before those working in such movements enter election contests, they should make sure they have developed their movements to the stage where participating in elections is worthwhile and not a waste of time and energy. As many of you may be aware, he gave a lot of guidelines on how best to proceed with this particular type of work. The second way Sadviparas control the social cycle is by forming governments. The type of government they form is discussed in more detail below in the following subsections. Finally, it is important to ask, how will Sadviparas rule emerge in society? The author states that the rule of Sadviparas will only come about through the systematic and rational application of Prout by many highly intelligent people. The systematic and rational application of Prout by many highly intelligent people. This is a very important point. It is not possible to establish the rule of Sadviparas by blind physical force or idle intellectual extravaganza. So this is an important point and is generally overlooked in discussions about Sadviparas and how they emerge in society. Now, the next point may be of interest to you, and some of you may find it a little controversial, so be warned. Sadviparas, a new type of leader. As indicated, the author proposes that a new type of leader will emerge in the future who will be both spiritually enlightened and capable of leading society. He also envisages that in due course, such Sadvipras will form governments. As examples of highly evolved spiritualists who inspired society in the past, he cites such people as Buddha, Mahavir Jain, Kabir, Mahaprabhu Chaitanya, and Ramakrishna. These examples illustrate the high spiritual standard the author had in mind when he talked about spiritual leaders. But to be a Sadvipra, highly evolved Sadvipras must also have the qualities necessary to be able to lead and govern society. To understand the concept of Sadvipras, and therefore the author's notion of leadership more deeply, we need to understand that the author discussed Sadvipras in at least 3 different concepts: in the organizational sense, in a general sense, and in an administrative sense. In the organizational sense, this is the sense the author used in the various organizations he founded. Here, those who are strict in various points of conduct are said to be Sadvipras. They are entitled to stand for the position of leader of a district, a bhukti, be appointed to members of a district committee, and are also able to vote in the election held to elect the district leader. Those who are not considered strict in the various points of conduct are not considered to be Sadvipras and cannot participate in the district elections or hold positions of leadership. In practice, this means an electoral college has to be created for the purposes of district elections, and only those who meet the required standard can be members of the electoral college, vote in the elections, and hold positions of leadership. This voting model is known as restricted franchise. It is not general franchise because not all those performing spiritual practices in the district have the right to vote. In addition, an electoral commission exists on the central level to supervise the district level elections. It also oversees, through returning officers, the creation of electoral colleges in each district. So the above example of an electoral system established by the author in his organizational system on the district level, there is 1, an electoral college system; 2, standardized criteria to qualify as a member of the electoral college; 3, restricted franchise; 4, the requirement that only members of the electoral college can hold positions of leadership; 5, compulsory voting for members of the electoral college; and 6, an electoral commission, which oversees the whole process. These are among the important reforms the author also proposes for democracy. In other words, the principles used by the author in his organizational system on the district level are some of the same principles he proposes to reform democracy, and as we shall see, also are applied in his ideal system of government. There is a consistency of principles in all 3 models. This is the takeaway. There's a consistency of principles in all 3 models. In the general sense, in this sense, Sadvipras are described in various ways, such as strict in the cardinal principles of morality, imbued with cosmic ideation, spiritual revolutionaries, fighters against corruption and exploitation, tirelessly engaged in selfless service, etc. This is the sense the author generally uses when he talks about Sadvipras controlling the social cycle, as mentioned in the above subsection. From the viewpoint of the social cycle, Sadvipras will never stop the ongoing class struggle, which manifests according to the laws of the social cycle. Their role is to fight against the supremacy of each social class. They are to protect the righteous and the exploited and subdue the wicked and the exploited through the application of force. And they may also accelerate the speed of the social cycle and bring about revolution. So there are numerous examples in the author's discourses where he uses the term Sadvipras in this general sense. So in this way, Sadvipras control the social cycle. They fight against the exploitation of the social cycles that dominate of the periphery of the social cycle. To be considered a Savipra in this sense of the term, one needs to develop various qualities and be engaged in certain types of selfless activities. Number 3, in the administrative sense, here Savipras are entrusted with the responsibility of leading society. This also was mentioned in the second answer to the question, how do Savipras control the social cycle, as discussed in the above subsection. In this sense, Savipras are described as experienced in the work of one of the branches of government, the legislature, executive, or judiciary, and also the audit branch, assuming such a branch is created in future. They also need to be experts in various aspects of the different branches to be appointed to work in one of the branches. The author used the terms experienced and experts to describe those with the administrative skills necessary to sit on various boards and sub-boards of a government. In this sense, he is referring to highly experienced administrators, those who, for the most part, will have had outstanding careers working in the various branches of government, or have developed expertise that is especially useful in the work of government. Clearly, to acquire the experience and expertise necessary to become a highly skilled administrator takes many years of dedicated work. Such skills are not developed overnight. So it is not unreasonable to say that in this sense, there are no Savipras in the world at present. So here, in this sense, Savipras control the social cycle by being members of governments. This is the sense the author uses when he's talking about his ideal system of government. He is talking about highly qualified people, those who, for the most part, have worked in government for many years or have developed particular areas of expertise that can be utilized in the work of government. He is not using the other two senses. So to summarize, one who may be considered a Savipra in the organizational sense may not be a Savipra in the general sense, and is highly unlikely to be a Savipra in the administrative sense. Working on the district level would not afford the opportunity to develop the skills necessary to work in the various branches of government or to work on higher administrative levels. In other words, one who's a Savipra in the organizational and general senses is unlikely to have acquired the professional experience or expertise necessary to be a Savipra in the administrative sense. However, we would expect a Savipra in the administrative sense also to be a Savipra in both the organizational and general senses. So when the author talks about his ideal form of government, he is talking about Savipras in a specific sense of the term. He is talking about those who are spiritually enlightened and also have the professional experience or expertise necessary to lead a government. Clearly, few people will have the requisite factors to be Savipras in this sense of the term. So in this sense, he combines together in one person two sets of qualities that have previously been considered separate: the spiritually enlightened and the administratively experienced, and suggests that such people alone should be empowered to lead government. This is a completely new conception of leadership. No social philosopher has conceived of such a combination before. The selecto-electional system. The author proposes that the socio-economic or political structure that will emerge in the future will be selecto-electional. This term needs a little explanation. It can be best understood as having a general and a specific application. Generally, a selecto-electional system is one in which only those who are first elected have the right to select or appoint. When the author first mentioned this system in 1959, India had been independent for 12 years and the country had a democratic government with general franchise. The Indian constitution, while drawing on various contemporary constitutions, is essentially based on the Westminster model. This is not surprising, since the British had ruled India for 190 years, up to 1947, and all the Indian leaders, most of whom were associated with the Congress Party, were schooled in the British system. So in India's democracy, the British model, which included general franchise, was largely followed. The selecto-electional system in the general sense was already operational in various democracies. For example, the US president is elected in a presidential election and then appoints the cabinet and various other officials. In the British system, a candidate is first elected to parliament and then elected as party leader and then appoints the cabinet minister. Both are examples of the selecto-electional system, in that only those who are first elected have the right to select or appoint cabinet ministers. And the US system, senior government officials as well. This is the general application of the selecto-electional system. Just an additional comment, this sense of the selecto-electional system is very common in the world today in many different places, and particularly common in various types of government administrations around the world. But as we shall see, the author uses the term in a very specific sense. Here, Savipras are elected by other Savipras to hold administrative positions, select or appoint good persons to carry out the executive duties in government and non-government spheres, and appoint top-ranking officials. Those elected to administrative positions formulate government policies, and those appointed to government positions execute the policies. This specific sense includes the general sense in that only those who are elected have the right to appoint, but it also requires that this role is to be carried out by Savipras. This is the feature that makes it different from democracies and the general electoral examples mentioned above. In essence, it outlines how the Savipras control the socio-economico-political structure and the author's ideal system of government. In the same way, the author supports the creation of an electoral college composed of educated, ethical, and socially, economically, and politically informed voters to reform democracy. In due course, an electoral college of spiritually enlightened and socially aware voters would need to be created for the author's ideal system of government as well. In all probability, the electoral college of spiritually enlightened voters would evolve out of the electoral college of educated and ethical voters, where we would expect this to occur naturally as spirituality becomes increasingly accepted in society. To summarize, the main features of the electoral system in the author's ideal socioeconomic political structure can be summarized as follows. An electoral college system consisting of Savipras, standardized criteria to qualify as a member of the electoral college, franchise restricted to Savipras, the requirement that only experienced and expert Savipras in the electoral college can hold positions of leadership, compulsory voting for the Savipras in the electoral college, and an electoral commission of Savipras which oversees the whole process. All these features would be set out in statutes, and an independent statutory authority consisting of Savipras would administer the whole system. Boards and subboards. In addition, the author proposes that government leaders would govern through a system of boards and subboards. Boards to oversee branches of government, the legislature, executive and judiciary and audit branches, and subboards created in each of the branches. Such a system would replace other forms of government. While the author did not specifically recommend the formation of a board for the audit branch of government, based on his discussion of the audit branch, it seems logical that such a board would need to be created. The members of the boards would be elected by the other spiritually enlightened and highly socially, economically, and politically aware members of society, by other Savipras. And as mentioned, to be elected or appointed as an administrative position on a board or subboard, a Savipra would have to have the required experience or expertise. Clearly, such a system is not only likely to emerge when spirituality is accepted and understood by large numbers of people in society. This point is important and gets back to the previous discussion about spirituality. So we would expect spirituality to be understood and accepted in society before such Sadvipras can emerge in great numbers to lead governments. Subboards in each of the 4 boards for the branches of government would be created as required to facilitate the work of government. These subboards would consist of spiritually enlightened people who are also experts in their respective field, and they would be drawn from those who work either in government or outside government. Finally, the author also proposes that the 4 boards would be overseen by a 5th board, the highest board, which would be responsible for formulating broad policy positions, supervising the 4 boards for the branches of government, and appointing expert personnel to the subboards. The author also says this board would elect ministers and a chairperson who would be the constitutional head. The ministers on this board, the Supreme Board, would perform functions similar to cabinet ministers today and oversee the work of their respective government departments. And the board itself would be broadly similar to a cabinet today. So finally, we summarize. Everything we've said in this second section is summarized in this brief following 2 pages. Now, it's a little bit compact, so I might skip over a little bit of it, but you can read it as I go through it slowly. But these notes will be available to those who are interested, and you can follow up with the references. So first point is there are sufficient Sadvipras in the society. Sadvipras function as members of the electoral colleges for purposes of electing the Sadvipras, and Sadvipras who nominate positions on the various board must be experienced in the work of government, and we would expect them to be have had a highly successful career working in government. Confederation structure. The Sadvipra board structure initially functions on 3 levels: the socioeconomic unit level, the federated level, and the confederation or world level. There are corresponding electoral colleges on each level. For example, the Sadvipras in the socioeconomic unit of Bengalistan would vote for the Sadvipra boards in their socioeconomic unit. All the Sadvipras in India, in all the socioeconomic units, would vote for the Sadvipra boards on the federated level. Remember, there are 44 socioeconomic units in India. If they come together as a federation, then those federations of 44 socioeconomic units would form federated boards that would function as the board or government for India. So this is the mechanism in which how that would happen. And all the Sadvipras in the world would vote for the Sadvipra boards on the confederation or global level. And the confederation level would function as the world government. Of course, this is at some point in the future. The Sadvipra boards on the confederation level and their respective branches and associated subboards function as the world government. Gradually, socioeconomic units will merge together based on factors such as economic parity, cultural mixing, communication facilities, and administrative efficiency. Similarly, gradually federations will also merge together. Eventually, after some time, the whole world will become one worldwide socioeconomic unit. And in future, the confederation would be expanded to include those living on other planets and celestial bodies. Boards. On each of the 3 levels, there are 5 Sadvipra boards: Supreme, Legislative, Executive, Judicial, and Audit, assuming the Sadvipras form audit boards. The chairperson of the Supreme Sadvipra board on the socioeconomic unit level would be the chief minister, premier, or governor of the socioeconomic unit. The chairperson of the Supreme Sadvipra board on the federation level would be the prime minister or president of the federation. And the chairperson of the Supreme Sadvipra board on the global level would be the constitutional head of the world government. The members of each board are elected by the Sadvipras in their respective jurisdictions. The legislative, executive, judicial, and audit boards supervise their respective branch of government. The Supreme Savipra Board is above the four boards for the branches of government on each level and is the highest board on that level. The functions of the board. This section goes into the functions of the boards. I'll just scroll through it slowly. It's a little bit technical, but it's a summation of the different things that Bala talks about in a couple of places. The Legislative Board, the Executive Board, the Supreme Board, the functions. This is all summarized in the discourse called Savipra Boards, the Judicial Board, the Audit Board, and finally, we come to sub-boards and the role of the sub-boards. This model is a collective benevolent dictatorship. Collective because in principle, individual dictatorship is rejected and decisions are taken by board members collectively. Benevolent because the role of Savipras is to help all creation merge into supreme consciousness, and dictatorship because Savipras alone hold and exercise political and administrative power. This model is not compatible with democracy or the author's model of a world government, which, if formed in the near future, is likely to be democratic. The author gives basically two broad models of a world government, and he uses two sets of terms. In one term, he talks about a lower house and an upper house and describes how the members come to be members of the upper house and lower house. And in another model, he talks about socioeconomic units, federations, and a confederation. And he talks about this model in the sense of Savipra dictatorship. So there are two broad models of world government in the author's works. And it seems like if a world government is formed in the near future, say over the coming decades or so, then the model that tends to be somewhat similar to a democratic model would be the model that would be likely to be formed. Only after Savipras have been formed that are capable of governing will the more developed model of world government be formed. So, for example, the Savipra Board has a great deal of power. Only Savipras can participate in elections. The cabinet system in democracy is transformed into the Supreme Savipra Board. The cabinet ministers sit on the Supreme Savipra Board. The legislature becomes the Legislative Savipra Board, making the need for a parliament and two houses redundant. And the secretaries in charge of the government departments sit on the Executive Savipra Board. The board system does away with the need for political parties, etc. This is the author's ideal system of government. So to summarize, we can see the author gave a broad outline of his model of an ideal government, but not much detail, which suggests that he expected that it would evolve naturally in due course as the members of society become increasingly more spiritual and the conditions required for such a system to work develop in society. He also made the point that he expected that the more spirituality becomes firmly established in society, the more democracy will fade away. So thank you. That concludes the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jayanta, for it's almost like a blueprint of P.R. Sarkar's ideas on government. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes probably for questions. Just going to start off the ball rolling here. Do Savipras necessarily, Jayanta, have to have political power in governments to manage the smooth running of the social cycle?
It's a good question. The discussion about the three senses in which the author talks about Savipras, I think helps to answer that question. When the author talks about the general sense, he's talking about Savipras in their broad sense in how they can impact the social cycle. So in that sense, they may or may not have political power. So there's great scope for Savipras to impact society move society forward without necessarily having political power. But when he's talking in the specific sense of Sadvipras and Sadvipras in government, in an administrative sense, clearly those types of Sadvipras or Sadvipras in that sense have to have the skills to be able to be competent members of government.
Thank you. Question from Shiv. What do we need to take it from theory to reality, the implementation of Prout?
From the viewpoint of setting up Prout, the way that I understand it is that the first step is to do what the author did in 1977, where he set up socioeconomic movements. Socioeconomic movements is the first step all around the world to creating socioeconomic units. The movement is designed to create the unit. So the first step is to set up a movement, get organized in and through the socioeconomic movements and develop them and strengthen them. And then in the course of time, they will develop and grow and have an impact on society.
Thank you, Jayanta. And there's a note here from Tapan. He's asking for the information in your talk to take a form of a book or booklets. You have written a number of books already co-authored and articles. So that would be a request to send us those links and make those available. That'd be great.
The presentation just given will be made available to Dada, and he can distribute it to the people who attended this class.
Great. Question from Prabhat. What are the qualities we should look for in a Sadvipra? You have outlined these to some extent, just in a nutshell, Jayanta.
I give the references in the presentation where the author talks about some of the qualities. And the interesting thing is that it depends on the sense that we're talking about. If we're looking at the first sense of the term of a Sadvipra on the district level, there's certain qualities that that person has to have. If we're looking at the Sadvipra on the general sense, in the broader context of society, there are other qualities. Now, there may be some overlap with two types of qualities, but the author talks about, broadly speaking, some other types of qualities that need to be developed. And when we look at the type of the third sense, where the author's talking about Sadvipras in the sense of those being experienced or experts in the work of government, again, we're looking at a different set of qualities. Again, there may be some overlap, but they're different sets of qualities. So my current understanding of this is that Sadvipras need to have a certain basic universal set of qualities to do with their ethical development and spiritual development. That's universal. Then how that is applied in the type of objective adjustment or context will depend on the, if you like, the experience of the person, what they're interested in, how they focus their attention, and so on.
Thank you, Jayanta. Just a final question very quickly. Does the concept of collective and benevolent dictatorship that you mentioned have any similarities between the dictatorship of the proletariat proposed by Marx? How's it
No,
how's it similar?
none at all. The Marx proletariat dictatorship is essentially theoretical. It's an abstract concept. The proletariat can never be a dictatorship. And in communism, the party takes on that role. And then, of course, the party in turn oppresses the proletariat, the working class and the other classes. So there's no similarity at all. The idea of a dictatorship simply in the Prout context means that it is the Sadvipras, those Sadvipras who have the administrative skills, hold a political power. That's what the author means when he talks about Sadvipra dictatorship. He doesn't mean any kind of autocratic government. It means that those who have the right to political power are the Sadvipras. Politicians don't have the right. And he's very specific about that. If you look back in his early works, he says politicians and political parties should not have the right to political power. Only moralists, ethical people, and spiritually developed people should be the ones that should have the right or authority to guide society. That's the essential point.
Thank you, Jayanta. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. Jayanta, it looks like we're going to have you come back again for more elaboration. Great talk. Thank you. Over to you, Tarakum Prana.
Thanks.